Morning, everyone. How are you? This is Elaine Miller-Karas. I am the co-founder of the Trauma Resource Institute. I see many familiar faces, so I want to welcome you to our CRM Global Call. We have a wonderful guest that I am so excited to introduce to you in just a minute. Let's wait till we get people hooked in, but I'm so excited because he's really going to help us understand legislation and what we might be able to access in our communities. Now, those of you that, I'm going to just say, I don't think you have access to the international funding, but Jesse, but I know you have a lot of information about funding that's available in the United States and how we can be advocates for what we believe in. And we'll talk more about that as we get going. So I'm going to invite people as they're coming in. So Jesse kind of has a little understanding of kind of the breadth of who comes to our little CRM Global calls. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat and say what part of the world you're from, that would really be awesome. So he can get kind of a little bit of a barometer too of the different ways. And I know, well, there's Scott Parker. Scott Parker, you sent me the sweetest email I practically ever gotten in my life. Thank you so much for that. Yes, I actually sent it to all the staff because I call that manna from heaven when somebody gives us a nice, sweet compliment. So thank you, Scott, for that. I want to say that to you in person. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So, yeah, we're going to just wait. Look at people are still coming in. Oh, we've got people from Northern Ireland. Oh my goodness, this is always exciting. And I know, and Scott, you're still in Lebanon, aren't you? Yes. I believe you're in Lebanon, Scott, unless you've come back to the States in the last minute. All right. All right. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone, wherever you are in the world. I know this has been it's been a trying time, hasn't it? So I just want to start out maybe for us to remember what else is true in our life right now. And so if you notice that maybe you're a little bit wobbly in your zone, or sometimes I get that way, I'm just going to invite you to think about what else may be true and call in something that brings you comfort, uplifts you, calms you. Maybe even remembering your favorite CRM moment. I've got a lot of those. I have to write another book. Maybe Lindy will write it with me. Our favorite CRM moments. And she's getting to be training as many people as I have in the world almost. All right. I just took a deep breath, just thinking about one of my favorite CRM moments. So I'm hoping that everyone can pause for that little resiliency pause that we do to remember what else is true as we get started today. So it is my honor to introduce to you Jesse Kohler. Jesse and I sit on some advisory committees together, and I knew him when he was, I think when I first met you, you were still one of those community members, Jesse. And then Jesse now is the executive director of CTIP, and he's going to tell you all about that. But I also want you all to know that his roots are really from community work, and he'll share a little bit with us about how that sparked his interest in now living in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to call you our trauma-informed guy in Washington that tries to let people know about the kinds of things that we're all doing with boots on the ground. He's also going to tell us how we can advocate for the parts of the world that we live in. And he's going to tell us about some buckets of money that may be available to expand the work that you're doing in your communities. So Jesse, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. I'm going to welcome you and also welcome people to ask you questions as well. So Jesse, tell us what CTIP stands for, because when you hear what it stands for, you'll know why we call it CTIP. So go ahead, Jesse.
Thanks, Elaine. So CTIP stands for the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, which is a mouthful for sure. But we work to promote trauma-informed, resilience-focused, and healing-centered and grassroots-led work around the country, and hopefully with folks on the call, around the world. And so it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I look forward to this conversation very much.
And some of you may be wondering, maybe you've never written a letter to a legislator, maybe you have, but one of the things that Jesse has shared with me, the importance of every single one of you on this call, is the importance of the story. And Jesse, maybe if you could maybe even start talking a little bit about the story in relationship to the legislative work that you do, and why it's important for all of the folks here on this call to understand that part of how you work legislatively.
Yeah, so like Elaine mentioned, my background is not in policy. I have been doing this work for about a year. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was the director of development at a community center in Philadelphia. So I was struggling to get funding for programs that I knew would help the communities that we served. And through that, saw the importance of policy and legislation. I think that what policy really does is it creates conditions for communities to potentially thrive, at least. Good policy creates those conditions that help uplift great practice in community. Good practice informs good policy, and good policy helps to promote good practice, like what all of you are doing. And so, the power of when I meet with a legislator in DC or someone from the administration, for instance, really does draw back from my experiences working at an inner city public high school and being able to discuss what the conditions and what the environment was like in those schools, or the populations that we served at Northlight Community Center, and the importance of having affordable childcare, the importance of having nurturing workforce development for teens and young adults, and the importance of having emergency services that kept all families afloat through the food cupboard and through the utilities funding and through the holiday assistance programs that we operated. So the work that all of you do, whatever it is the most powerful advocacy tool that we collectively have for the movement we're trying to build, right? The most powerful advocate is the constituent of an elected official. And so not everybody has to be comfortable and want to jump right into advocacy right away. And CTIP wants to be here to help amplify your stories as we learn more about all of the work that's going on around the country. But to the extent that you all are comfortable, as constituents, your elected officials, Congress people, legislators, need to listen to you. They are there to serve you and the communities that you serve. And so to the extent that you're comfortable telling your story, the work that you see either personally or professionally, that becomes the strongest advocacy push that we can have to continue to promote upstream approaches, creating those resilience-informed and trauma-informed environments.
So Jesse, I'm just wondering, the trauma-informed kind of spread through many community-based organizations within the United States and abroad. But so are legislators learning about the importance of like trauma-informed and the adverse child experiences study and kind of like what to do next? Can you tell us a little bit about, are there ones that are kind of like the champions for trauma-informed?
For sure. So in states, we are more connected to the federal government because of our own organizational capacity right now than state government. But there are, just to mention, a number of state legislators who are champions for trauma-informed work and legislation. And we have a group that we started called Legislators Invested in Fighting Trauma, or LIFT. That sort of—
I love that name, LIFT. They're called LIFT. I love that. Yeah. Okay, so we have legislators that are lifting us. All right. Okay, good. I love that. All right.
That's a great tagline for the
group. I haven't heard that one yet, Jesse. Lift. I'm going to remember.
They named themselves, but it's a great group.
They named themselves. Okay, that's a positive thing. Okay, that's a positive thing. All right, keep going.
And just to mention, what's really strong and powerful about the movement that we're all involved in is that it is truly bipartisan, or what I would prefer to call it is nonpartisan, where that LIFT group is co-chaired by Assemblyman Andrew Hevesy, who is from New York and a Democrat, and Representative Sherry Connolly, who is a Republican from Oklahoma. And there is bipartisan representation on that group. Similarly, at the federal government level, we have on the House side, the House Trauma Informed Care Caucus is co-chaired by Danny Davis, who's a Democrat from Chicago, and Mike Gallagher, who is a Republican from Wisconsin. And on the Senate side, which we'll get into the Rise from Trauma Act in a bit and discuss that specific legislation in more detail, but that is co-sponsored by Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois and Senator Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia, Democrat and Republican respectively. And so the exciting thing is that we have champions in pretty much every chamber of Congress and at various levels of government. And we also have it not just bicameral, which means in both the House and the Senate, but also bipartisan on both the Republican and Democratic side. And the last thing that I'll say, because I fear that I'm droning on a little bit here, is that the excitement and recognition of ACEs and trauma and the importance of promoting resiliency and healing started before 2020. But the need for it was certainly exacerbated, and recognition of the need for this work was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects that we are seeing throughout our society today. And so there continues to be more and more recognition, and I can put in the chat later, the appropriations. So Appropriations Committee is the committee in Congress that gives money to various programs. And the Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, and related agencies recently put out their FY22 appropriations bill. And that had over 30 programs that were targeted to address trauma that they gave money to, and had over 60 mentions of trauma, resilience, and ACEs, which compared to 2017, which is when CTIP started and was our first session, there were 0. And so we see that continued growth and recognition of the importance of trauma, resilience, and healing. And we know that there is still, although 30 is a tremendous number of programs, there is more opportunity to continue to advocate for continued investment from Congress to recognize all of the places, all of the issues that they are trying to address, and recognize that trauma and resilience have a root cause in each of those, and continuing to provide more funding, more money to those programs.
Jesse, I have a question. So there were 30 programs that were given money by the federal government. So those 30 programs, I don't know how we could find out the names of those, are they disseminating community-based programs, like say some of our people that may be in North Carolina, I see Lindy from Georgia, that they could actually contact one of those programs and say, I understand you have a bucket of money. We're doing some work in a community that impacts what you're doing. We would like to bring the community resiliency model into your organization. Is that possible? I mean, I'm wondering, how do we access those 30 people that got all that money to help our people out there in the field?
It depends. To my knowledge, I am not sure, right? Head Start got, for instance, $250 million. I want to say it was, which is for quality improvement to increase mental health services, to provide care and counseling to families through Head Start. Could that be leveraged by Head Start to provide CRIM training? I think that that's up to Head Start, right? Similarly to how we'll talk about the American Rescue Plan Act, I think that there is internal advocacy that can be done to say there is a model that can support what this money was given for, and we would love to partner together in making that happen. It's worth having the conversation. I just put in the chat the our summary of that Labor Age Appropriations Subcommittee bill, if folks are interested in seeing where those buckets of money are.
Well, see, I think even just knowing that, I didn't know that they specifically got money for mental health. And we know that, of course, that the community resiliency model works really well with children and parents and teachers. And so that may be something for each one of you. If you are in a particular part of the world where you're connected to a Head Start program, which many of us are, you may be able to go to them and say, have you thought of, we know that you receive this money from the federal government. Is this coming down to our individual Head Start in upstate New York, for instance, where Tina Snyder works for Catholic Charities? You know, who knows? I mean, I guess it's a possibility of that. And that's one of the reasons why we felt it was important that we all know what's happening there, because it does sift down to the communities. But if we don't know it's there, how do we know even to ask the question? And I think, and also, Jesse, I think, I don't know if it was you or Carrie that told me that there are many school systems right now that are, and we can talk about the American Rescue Act in a minute, but are getting a lot of money and don't know what to do with it all. And I mean, that to me is like, really? Well, we know what we can do. Look at Lori Strand from, I know what I would do with that money. We can get some more crim teachers in there, right? So, and I'm Reggie's like, Reggie too.
Yeah, Reggie's loving it.
Yeah, he's loving that. So, but I just think these are the kinds of things that we need to know about as community resiliency model teachers, because I do think that we can be advocates for this as well. So so thank you for letting us know just even about that. And the summary is going to tell us the other agencies that receive that money.
Exactly. And some of that may be able to be leveraged, some of it may not be, but for it's obviously a direct and quick win. Even if the money isn't able to be leveraged in every pot, what's exciting to see is that there is a growing and increasing knowledge and awareness that this is where money needs to go to work upstream on the issues that Congress is working to prevent and address. And so in future bills and in future sessions and in other legislation, there is opportunity to continue to promote this work. And the one thing that I'll say based on what you just shared, Elaine, is not only is it exciting for you all to know that, there are these opportunities in DC that need to mobilize, and hopefully CTIP can play a conduit sort of role to make sure that folks around the country are aware of various opportunities. And like I said, someday we do hope to have a little bit more of a global presence. We're a way away from that. But in addition to that, the importance of all of you sharing your stories and letting Congress know about the great work that's going on and making sure that they are aware of what they can be putting their money toward is sort of the symbiotic process and relationship that needs to exist between the grassroots and higher levels of government to make sure that funds and resources are being appropriated in the best way possible to address the issues and create the conditions that we all are trying to work toward.
And this is really important, because what I love about what Jesse's doing and what CTIP is doing is that, let's say you're out in whatever state you're in, you go, oh, I really don't know how to do that. You can contact Jesse. Jesse's going to give you his email, and you can go. So look at Amber just smiled. Amber can go, okay, I can call Jesse. I know who my legislator is. Can Jesse give me the talking points that I can go talk to my legislator about what we're doing in our organization, so that they know that we're boots on the ground and we need funds, right? So, and we know that the mental health challenge is great right now. And especially with COVID and this variant, and I mean, and just all the other things that all of us dealt with before COVID, right? That hasn't gone away. And then we have but I think there is, I mean, this is like the horror of COVID, and yet there's this little lining, I think that silver lining that you just mentioned, Jesse, is there's a tension in the federal government regarding these issues. That's what I heard you say. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so now I'm wondering, should we move into the American Rescue Plan? Because that's something that I didn't know even existed until you told me about it.
Sure. So for folks, we have a webinar that will go into more detail about the American Rescue Plan Act on this website, as well as various resources, a summary of different sections in the American Rescue Plan Act that can be leveraged for mental health supports, a talking points document to support your advocacy and the broad buckets that are really available and flexible that can be used for trauma-informed, resilience-focused, and healing-centered work, and some other resources. So I encourage folks to, look at that website, and really there will be more information in that than what I'm able to share today. But essentially, in the American Rescue Plan Act, that was the stimulus so the stimulus funds that the government put out when Biden was first elected to office in March, that was passed to create growth and continued growth in the economy, right? So when we think about the payments that were given to families in the CARES Act, which American Rescue Plan Act is the second, really the third, but the second big bill that was similar to CARES Act that was passed at the beginning of the pandemic, that had the Paycheck Protection Program. That's what this bill is. And beyond just those payments that were sort of broadly talked about throughout society, we have other buckets that can be leveraged for trauma-informed, resilience-focused, and healing-centered supports. And broadly, the 4 key buckets where there are flexible funds are aid to state, local, and tribal governments. And this is the greatest area where there is opportunity to create comprehensive cross-systems, collaborative efforts to address trauma and promote resiliency. And so we really encourage folks to, if you have relationships with people in local governments, tribal governments, or state governments, probably in the executive branch, but feel free to leverage any relationship that you have, and they can tell you where the money goes, because it really does depend on the municipality or the state or the tribe that you're in who is controlling the money. There is flexible financing to commit to comprehensive cross-systems effort. So in our case, and with the knowledge base that is in this room, developing greater awareness of the community resiliency model and teaching CRM to continue to promote resiliency as we emerge from the pandemic may be able to address the mental health language that is in the American Rescue Plan Act. Similarly, there is a massive amount of money for the K-12 education system. It's called the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER funds, but there was $122.6 billion that was granted to school districts across the United States. That money, 90% of those funds, so 10% of the funds went to state education agencies to actually move money, because as I'm learning, it takes money to move money, which is a whole, it's very meta. But 90% of those funds went to local education agencies or the school districts themselves to decide how they were going to spend those funds. Like Elaine discussed earlier, for those who have worked in the education system, many school districts are not used to having a surplus of funding, right? Many school districts have had to operate out of a deficit, or a deficit mindset at least, for a long time, having to operate with limited resources for even paper in the school that I was working in. And now they have this surplus of millions of dollars that they are being almost burdened with to figure out how to spend, because the people who are spending the funds have other jobs that they still need to do. And so there is an opportunity for advocates to really go in and say, we think that this can help your school in X, Y, and Z ways, right? That is sort of the job of the advocate. But there is, again, a huge amount of money, and one of the allowable expenses is to promote mental health for students and staff. And we know that because this is one-time funding, a lot of schools and a lot of districts wisely are not going to begin hiring new staff people, because in 2 years, when the funding goes away, they would have to probably lay those people off. And so implementing a community resilience model or a similar model that can develop an upstream approach and sort of create these a universal and shared responsibility across all school staff for the mental health and well-being of students and staff alike, and creating that environment is a great investment that is being heard in a different way by many school districts. And so we would certainly encourage folks to look at the ESSER funds as another advocacy bucket. There are 2 more big buckets. One is, there's also money for early childhood education systems. And Elaine, feel free to cut me off.
Yeah, because I think what you're saying, I'm just getting excited thinking about it. But when we talk about sustainability, one of the things we know through the community resiliency model. So, actually, Lindy, Grabby, where are you? I want to ask you to unmute yourself for a second. So Lindy, you got trained back in what I think we said 2015. And so for a while, you were the only CRM teacher there in Atlanta. But how many people do you think that through, you created a sustainability model in Atlanta, because then you decided to train other CRM teachers. How many people you told me a big old number the other day about how many people you've trained in CRM?
Okay. So since there was just me 6 years ago, there are now over 70 CRM teachers, not everybody certified. And I think that with everything I've been doing every week, over the last 6 years. I think I personally have taught the model to over 6,000 people.
Okay, so 6,000. So I'm bringing this up because each one of you as CRIM teachers have the same potential, and maybe there's others in your bucket, but now with Zoom too, you can partner with other CRIM teachers, even if you don't have a huge number. But if you can get, let's say you could train 20 CRIM teachers per school district, that could create a sustainability model past the 2 years. And I want to just emphasize that, because that's what we've seen. Really, we've seen that all over the world, really. So if you can start to do that and contact them and saying, this is our idea, because we can help you craft that, right? Saying, CRIM has done this. CRIM has been used in schools at, Wake County and in Lori Strand. What's the name of your school district up in Idaho?
Blaine County.
Blaine County. Thank you. I lost that one for a second. And I don't know who else is on the call there from other school districts, but you see what I'm saying is that there can be a template that says, this is what we can do. You got 20 CRIM teachers, and they can train the teachers, they can train the parents, and also they can create programs for the kids. And that can be a sustainability model past the 2 years. So I just want to emphasize that. And if you need help along those lines too, we may be able to have another meeting too, Jesse, with you to talk about the components of that. So I really want to, really kind of wet your whistle with that, or spark that idea of what we might be able to do in terms of a workshop on how to approach the local school district. Okay, let's go ahead, Jesse. I'm getting real excited about these possibilities now. Okay.
That's great. Me too.
Right.
If anybody has questions, like, again, this is more of a conversation, and I recognize that
yes,
I'm speaking a lot, but feel free to put questions.
Yeah, and know that Alina is looking at the chat. If you have a question, please put it in there. And even though I'm also wanting to I really always so appreciate when we have people from Lebanon, Ireland, I think we have someone from India as well, is that some of these ideas, we may not be able to use that pot of money for your part of the world, but I think some of these ideas can be similar, because there are many governments around the world that are creating pockets of money to be able to help their children because of what's been happening about this, the whole mental health challenge. In some areas of the world, it's the first time they're really talking about how can we help the mental health of our community. So I just wanted to add that to our international community. Okay, go ahead, Jesse.
Exactly. To Elaine's point, the way that we advocate for this work is similar. And I can only speak about Canada because that's the only other country that I've done work in legislation for, but they've created funding buckets for trauma-informed education. And as various countries continue to see the impact of the pandemic on student and staff mental health and well-being, we can continue to advocate for that. And I think that one of the biggest advocacy pushes, and then I'll get into the other funding buckets, and one of the best talking points that I've been able to use so far, is that this is really to address staff mental health and well-being as much as it is for students. This is an entire school environment. And like Dr. Bruce Perry and other researchers have told us, a dysregulated adult can help regulate a dysregulated child. And so we really need to work upstream with staff and create a safe environment for all people in the school environment to promote the mental health and well-being for all people, including students, but also the staff, because we know that the pandemic has adversely impacted all of us in some way. And so helping to process that is very, very important as we go into the next and future school years. There's also a good bucket of money in the early childhood education space. That money is being subgranted to qualified childcare providers. So that is like the most grassroots bucket of funding that is available, but that would be a childcare provider. There are six buckets of money. 5 of them are really for the infrastructure of childcare, because at least in the United States, childcare itself is economically not a sustainable model as it's currently operated with, how little staff is paid. We see that there's a huge amount of turnover. And so there are problems there. And so a lot of that funding has the possibility of just stabilizing the childcare sector. But the 6th bucket is for, again, the mental health and well-being of staff and students. And so that money can be leveraged, again, similarly to how we were talking about ESSER funds, for the same purposes, just in early childhood education settings. And so again, wanted to make you aware of that. I saw one person in the chat earlier mention in Birmingham, Alabama. I miss it. Oh, Tina, it was you. Yes. So there is a bucket of money that was put into the American Rescue Plan Act to address the secondary and vicarious trauma, as well as some of the direct trauma that was experienced by healthcare workers on the front line during the pandemic. We've seen substance use, suicide, and turnover in the healthcare industry, especially with nurses on the front line, magnify tremendously. And so there are several buckets of money that are being subgranted to healthcare organizations, hospital systems, and the like for programs that can promote resiliency and well-being really in those frontline healthcare providers because of the impact that the pandemic has had. Yes, it's through HRSA, exactly. And so there's an opportunity certainly to potentially leverage American Rescue Plan Act dollars for that reason. And then again, with hospital systems, so many of them are well enough funded that, like I was telling Elaine before everybody else got on, what the American Rescue Plan Act also creates is an opportunity to begin the discussion. And if they don't have American Rescue Plan Act dollars, but you still tell them why, what your program or what CRM is, why it's so important, it begins the conversation where maybe not in early childhood education, but in hospital systems, they can then leverage other dollars to fund your program, right? And so it creates that open door opportunity to begin the conversation that can potentially leverage other dollars. So just to mention that, and I would look forward to hearing about sort of your experiences.
And Jesse, sorry to interrupt you, but I think as you're saying that too, because we have a number of people in the nursing field that have been researching CRM. Of course, Lindy, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself again. Lindy's been, one of our leading researchers, many of you know, but I think this is very important, Lindy, what he's talking to us about, because I'm going to ask you to do one more thing for me. I've asked you many things in my life, but if there are people that want to reach the healthcare providers in their community, would you be willing to be on a call, like a little workshop for them about what you've been doing? Because I know that you've just gotten the data from your 1 hour CRM training that is showing promising results. So
we're just finalizing the analysis of another randomized control trial that we conducted during the pandemic and with hospital workers here in Atlanta. And we included not just doctors and nurses, but housekeepers and food service and security people and admin. And we're getting the same results we keep getting. This was 1 hour virtual. And although I would say there was not a lot of time to practice, we used the chat and people participated, when we asked them questions. So actually, I don't think it was boring for anybody. And we've got this down to a science. We must have taught it, I don't know, dozens of times in order to get the numbers to do the analysis. But again, the sense of well-being increases. We see secondary traumatic stress symptoms go down, and that's closely related to burnout. But the secondary traumatic stress symptoms, it's very much akin to PTSD. So there's a big chunk of healthcare providers who already had PTSD before the pandemic, and depression too, and suicidality. So this is critical to get it out there. And we're doing since the surge started a couple of weeks ago, we are doing 1 hour classes here at Emory for the nurses who are in the COVID units. And so we were going to teach the leadership of an entire hospital system up in North Georgia at Dalton, where they've had just overflowing COVID units. And they had to cancel. We will do it eventually, but they had to cancel because they're opening a new COVID unit in that hospital. I just want to put a plug in for the concept of the CRM guide. And Elaine, the fact is that if we teach 100 teachers in a workshop, say a 3-hour workshop, so they have a real grip on the model and the skills, and then they listen to iChill a bunch of times so they get it right. The potential impact on children and families could be just amazing. So Elaine, tell us about the name of the person who, she had just become a CRM teacher in Northern California at the beginning of the pandemic or just before, and she was alone in a huge hospital system. And all she
I remember her name. But anyway, but I think what you're talking about is what happens is that people can, with one person, start to train people in their institutions, and then they know the skills, and then we call them, we have a name for them, they're CRM guide. They're not certified CRM teachers like most of you here, but then they can spread that. And Lori Strand is smiling because I know you've done that in Blaine County. I mean, Lori, why don't you unmute yourself for just a second, because I want you to know Lori, because she was kind of like the one along with Melissa Boley, but you did something pretty spectacular up there. And what's happening now, from kind of piggybacking on what Lindy's saying regarding schools?
Yeah. Well, I can say it can take just one, and I think most of us know that probably on this call, but I think we have something like 15 trainers, and our community's only about 20,000 people spread out over 3 towns. And so my dream is to potentially become like the first CRM community, because we are so small, if we can figure out that. But it's in, it's our, the way that all of our psychologists and counselors and social workers and administration knows that when there's a crisis in the school, it's the way that we respond to everything. It's in all of our social service agencies. And so now it's just integrating it into general public. Our private schools have just adopted it as well, doing trainings this year with them. So yeah.
And didn't you just do something with NAMI as well? Was that you?
Yeah, we did. Just teamed up with NAMI Idaho and Boise State School of Social Work to start integrating it, hopefully into the university there, starting at the social work school. And then, yes, working with NAMI Idaho as the board president of NAMI Idaho is a big ambassador of CRM and wants it to be required for all support group facilitators to have that basis and training before they can facilitate.
Okay, so, and just so NAMI is the National Alliance of the Mentally Ill. So I'm, Jesse, I also want you to hear this, because I know you've heard a lot about this, but you see that people are already working in the arenas that you're talking about. And so what we're saying in this call is we've got a lot of talent in this room right here. And so if we can also help you, your outlet saying, oh, I hadn't thought about what Lori's done or what Lindy's done. We've got people already working with nurses. And I was even thinking, Lindy, we should maybe have you do a workshop and you give us that 1-hour training that you're doing, so you can model that of how we can replicate it. Because you sent me the slides. It's like, it is definitely a CRM light, but yet CRM light seems to work too. So let's cultivate that. But I want to come back to Jesse, because we got a lot of expertise and he's not done yet. So Jesse, we got 20 minutes left. So I'm going, we got to get this all in.
We'll start skipping the rock instead of letting it speak so far. That's on me. It's very easy to do so. There is a tremendous amount of expertise in this room. It is very clear. And, I recognize, as a young, I'm young and have a little bit of experience, but really the power that we can leverage is building the movement and having everybody sort of team up and join together to share their story. And so I just want to share that we started a national trauma campaign to do exactly that, which folks can join. We actually have international representation, which again, we still need to figure out exactly how to leverage advocate voices in other countries and support them in the best way possible. So folks on this call who are not in the United States, I would love to have conversations to figure out how we can support you without necessarily knowing exactly the governing structure and all as advocates. But, our collective voice is what is going to move mountains, showing that groundswell of support, as well as connecting you as advocates to your congressional offices to promote calls to action that we will communicate is huge. Additionally, we have free monthly calls that are open called CTIP CAN, which is the Community Advocacy Network, which for folks who sign up for the National Trauma Campaign are able to join those calls. Folks who don't sign up for the National Trauma Campaign are also welcome to join those calls. I just operate off that listserv. And so if folks aren't yet comfortable joining the National Trauma Campaign, but want to join those CTIP CAN calls, you can either direct message me or email me with the email in the chat, and I can add you to that listserv as well. But to your point, Elaine, we would love to amplify the great work that is being done so that way other people can learn from each other. An hour is a good time for me, but really there's more information that is going on around the country, and to the extent that CTIP can play that bridge role so that way folks can learn from each other and we remove silos from within the trauma-informed, resilience-focused, and healing-centered movements around the country and around the world. That is a huge role that we're playing as well. So I just wanted to throw all that out there, and while doing it quickly, hope that it made sense and landed decently well.
And Jesse, could you tell us about the RISE Act and how we can support that effort right now? Because that seems to be a very important piece of legislation that could get passed.
So the Rise from Trauma Act is still in progress, but is probably the single biggest piece of legislation that is currently being used that can elevate the trauma-informed, resilience-focused, and healing-centered movements at the community level. Like we said, policy has the ability to create conditions in communities, and RISE really exemplifies that in its first section. So Section 101, as it's currently written, would provide $4.8 billion in funding over 8 years. So $600 million a year for 8 years to create local, or not just create, but also support, if one already exists, local trauma coordinating bodies. It gives the power to communities to decide what they need and what their efforts need to look like, given the resources available in the community, the populations that the community has and serves, to reduce the impact of trauma, prevent ACEs in trauma, and promote resiliency. The R in RISE stands for resilience. And so there is a huge advocacy push right now to support this piece of legislation. And if folks are interested in getting more involved, feel free to reach out to me and I can send you a direct email into your congressperson's office to a staffer who may be able to support, as well as some template email language that you would have to edit a little bit. So that way it's coming from you and not just a form email necessarily. And so if folks are interested in that, feel free to reach out to me and I can provide you with that language to reach out to your senators to try to get more co-sponsors. But there is also an easier way to take action, which is the link that I just put in the chat, where you can fill out that form, frankly, while we're on this call, and it will send an email to both of your senators, and you can also tweet at your senators to co-sponsor and support the Rise from Trauma Act as it continues to move through. And so that's an easier way to take action. Feel free to share that with your networks as well, that link, because the more that we are able to show this groundswell of support, the better off we are going to be. Know that you can also edit the email language that is filled out in that form. But again, that's an easier way to take action and a little bit of a lighter lift. In addition to the money that's going to communities, it's worth mentioning that there is a section in the bill that creates the opportunity to enhance what's called the performance partnership pilot, which essentially all that does is blends and braids existing funding to be able, so let's say that there's money that's for childcare and there's money that's for healthcare, but all of it is to essentially reduce the impacts of trauma and promote resiliency. If this bill passes, there will be greater ability to blend and braid those funds to all go toward the same program that does that in a broader sense. And then there's also an entire section on workforce development for educators, for healthcare workers, for community leaders, to continue to build awareness and make sure that we are promoting more trauma-informed awareness and resilience-focused awareness in various human service sectors, essentially. And so all of that is in the Rise from Trauma Act. It's been introduced in the Senate. It is about to be introduced in the House, and it's going to be very similar companion bills. As mentioned earlier, it's co-sponsored, initially co-led by Dick Durbin and Shelley Moore Capito, one Democrat, one Republican, and it's also co-sponsored by Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, who's a Republican, and Tammy Duckworth from Illinois, who's a Democrat, and there are a few other Dems who have since co-sponsored, but when it was originally introduced, this is truly bipartisan legislation and
You
continues
think
to.
it has a fairly decent chance of passing?
Based on what we're seeing, so the biggest question is not, for us, is not whether it will pass, but that $4.8 billion figure is pretty large, and that could end up getting whittled down. There is an effort to find other ways to sort of find that funding through, say, the infrastructure bill that is currently being passed as well. So that way the $4.8 billion exists for community-led efforts, and they don't have to fight it out in the appropriations process, because a quick sidestep into like Congress 101, the $4.8 billion is authorized, not appropriated. That means that that is the maximum level of funding that could go toward that program. So when a level is authorized in legislation, there is then an appropriations process, which then allocates or appropriates the level of funding that it will actually get. So if we can find a bucket of money of $4.8 billion to go to this program, it won't then have to go into the appropriations process where you have to take away from other programs to create a new program.
Oh, I see. So who would broker something like this? Would this become under SAMHSA? It's like those of us sitting out there going, if this does get passed, how do we even know it's gotten passed? And what governmental agency would be distributing these kinds of funds?
I am not positive who will be distributing it. It could be SAMHSA. It could be another agency that operates under the Secretary of probably Health and Human Services, I would imagine. But we will make sure, again, sign up for the National Trauma Campaign. We, like Elaine is a member, and other organizations where we will continue to amplify. And there are other partners who will continue to amplify if and when this legislation is passed. So that way communities can work to apply for the grants that would be made available through the Rise from Trauma Act. So we will do everything in our power to make it available and known. And based on the fact that folks are on this call, or if someone's watching the recording, you signed up for the call, you will probably receive some notification over the 8 years, many, many times, that that the Rise from Trauma Act is passed and that this money is available to be applied for.
So I'm hoping that you all can see how important it is that we keep abreast of this kind of information, because it can directly impact the communities that we're working in. And so by becoming connected with CTIP, you'll have ongoing information. And then we can also have Jesse come back again when some of these programs are being disseminated and when legislation actually passes. But right now, it would be helpful if we did write to our legislators about the RISE Act and saying, please support that, because it could come down and greatly impact our community. I mean, is that what you have a sample letter for us, Jesse? Is that what you said that we can email out? Okay.
Yeah, so I can get you sample email language, and then also staffers in your Senate offices, as well as staffers in your House offices when the House bill is introduced. So that way you have the individuals to reach out to. It would probably be a legislative director or legislative staffer to start the email, and then we have template language that we can send out. Elaine, if you want for me to send that to Elena.
Yes, send it to Lena, and then she can send it out
Lena.
to people who, yes.
Sure. So I can do that following this. It would be a bit too long for the chat box here. But also to support your advocacy efforts, I want to share that, like, regardless of advocacy, and this is something that can some of these can certainly support folks in other countries. We have a number of infographics that help to illustrate the impact that you would be discussing in your advocacy efforts. And so feel free to leverage those infographics. We have a social media toolkit on that same website, and feel free to use those, spread them far and wide to help support the conversations that you're having, because it's a good leave behind from those conversations. So that way legislators who are in meetings all the time are able to look back on something. I'm also seeing this one comment in the chat that is overly kind, but all of you are truly wonderful. Again, my roots come from community work, and the only reason that I am at the federal level is because I became, probably because I was very young and still am, but increasingly frustrated by the lack of support and opportunities to promote work similar to what you're doing. I remember that it really started for me. I was doing a program called LOVE, which was lowering overdose and violence epidemics through Northlight Community Center. And it was impossible, nearly impossible, to get funding to support parents and children through trauma-informed, resilience-focused, and healing-centered work, right? Maybe that was in part because I didn't have all the language that I know now, but in part because the investment wasn't there broadly throughout society. And so my goal is to help to support folks like you to do the work on the ground, where we know that healing happens, where we know that resilience is promoted through caring relationships. And so truly, you are all the champions, and I thank you for the work that you're doing.
I think there's one more question. I don't want to, before we still have about 9 minutes left, but we were talking about the opioid epidemic, and that about the pharmaceutical company settlement and what's happening with that in terms of state distribution. Can you share that with everybody? Because that was like a little bit disheartening when I heard about what's happening with actually the distribution.
So many people, folks may have heard about the opioid settlement that was reached following the opioid epidemic with 3 of the major drug manufacturers that promoted the opioid epidemic, as well as one communications firm that developed the communication strategy that really amplified the impact of the opioid epidemic. There was an agreement that was pending of about $26 billion of funding that would go to states and municipalities to create, it was really for 2 buckets. We have treatment and we have prevention, that $26 billion would go toward. The caveat to that money is that if it was agreed upon by states and the municipalities, those manufacturers and those that were being held responsible in the lawsuit would no longer be able to be sued for that purpose. That would constitute double jeopardy essentially in the court system. And so states and municipalities are currently deciding whether or not they want to take that bucket of money and forego any more responsibility that could be held for the opioid epidemic against those pharmaceutical companies, drug manufacturers, and communications firms that were held responsible, or not take the money and be able to potentially either get more money or continue to hold those that were responsible, hold them responsible. And so that's what is currently being negotiated. And again, if states and municipalities decide to just take that money and agree that that is worth foregoing responsibility moving forward, there will be an insurgence of billions of dollars across the country to promote prevention and treatment. And again, we are really promoting that when folks talk about mental health, we look toward upstream prevention, the sort of work that you all do to train broadly. So that way we approach this from a systems level of promoting mental health, but it also goes toward allocating good treatment models that can help to address the addiction and needs that has been created through the opioid epidemic. So we are not exactly sure where that stands currently, which that was the part, again, those strings that get tied to these decisions at a higher level is what Elaine and I were talking about earlier. That's just an important consideration as we move forward.
All right, Jesse, thank you so much. I mean, you're so informative, and there's a lot of people that are saying things to you in the chat, and I see that Stephanie would like to have a conversation. So I'm just want to make sure that people know how to contact you. Yeah. And then those of you that want to contact Try, just send an email to Alina, and we can set something up. But I'm also, really wanting people to also, if you feel like you need another workshop about how to, go ahead and approach your school district, for example, or your municipality, that I know that Jesse and I can put something together so that we have a longer time together to actually strategize about, here are the steps, this is what you do, A, B, C, D, and E. Because I know, I've learned a lot over the years, and I used to always say, well, the legislator should talk to me. Sometimes they do, but it's the aide. You get a good aide to believe in what you're doing, that aide has a lot of leverage with their congressperson. So I think this is another, just to know that. I mean, maybe you didn't know that when you came to CRM, you're also going to be learning stuff legislatively, but we hope that this is going to help what you're doing in the world, because it's so important. So Jesse, do you have any final words for any wise statements for such a young, wise man right now?
Not as much wisdom as is in the rest of this Zoom room. So I'll start by saying that for folks who want the last CTIP can call, which we did last week, is that most recent YouTube link that is under my email address. And that was an advocacy workshop. And one of my colleagues, Whitney Maris, who is brilliant in MSW, who's working toward LCSW, did with us an advocacy workshop that may be helpful to get deeper into how we tell our story, what the process is to really go toward and promote getting that funding. Again, I think that, your stories, a lot of times in this work that we do, we take for granted how special and rare it is. We see it as common sense, and who wouldn't know? But you speaking up and talking about what you see in the world, whether it's to a legislator, another stakeholder, some other elected official, or just folks in the community, your voice has so much power. You have so much power in the work that you do, working to help others and help the communities that you serve. And so I just encourage you all to have meaningful conversations, continue to promote this work, let other folks know, so that way we continue to grow the movement, because there is strength in numbers. We're stronger together. And just really thank you for the work that you do. And to Lois, yes, I live in Navy Yard in DC. So yeah, would love to connect and have, a longer
Oh,
conversation.
you definitely need to know Lois. Lois,
I need to know everybody in this call. You are all amazing.
Lois she was instrumental in getting us into Walter Reed Military Medical Center, and she and I we spoke 3 years at the national conference helping our wounded warriors. So Lois, it's always a pleasure to see you, my friend.
So good to see you too, Elaine.
My heart, thank you.
We'd love to connect with you, Jesse.
Please, Lois, I would enjoy that thoroughly. And everybody else. And again, just the final thing that I'll say is, for folks who are located outside of the country, it's amazing to see sort of the spread that CRIM's had. Elaine shared that the CRIM model is known in 145 countries, which is just a mind-boggling number. But, I would love to connect and see how we can support you in promoting talking points and getting these conversations going elsewhere, because we know that this is not an American-centric problem, right? We really need to promote this around the world, and anything that I can do to support you all, I would love to have that conversation and help where I can. So thank you all for having me. I hope to be with you all again soon, really.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, everyone, for being on the call. And please be safe as you go out into your world. It is a little bit of a treacherous place right now. And just keep remembering what else is true, all of you and all the beautiful work that you do. So thank you so much. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Elaine. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.